Hey there, and welcome. So, Side Effects is holding a new Houdini art challenge called Mardini, which is starting on the 1st of March. The idea of it is to create an artwork in Houdini based on a daily prompt. That prompt is basically just a theme to base your artwork around. It's open to anyone who would like to enter, and if you do enter, it doesn't have to be every day. Last year, there were prizes for Best Daily, Best Weekly, Best Collection, Best Overall Artwork, and for entering every day. So, as you may know, I won Best Collection in last year's Houly Art Challenge, and so I thought I would give some tips to help you in this year's Art Challenge. I think you should...
Do it! Just
do it. So I'll also be doing daily review videos where I'll be giving my opinions on the artworks for each day, so your artworks might show up in those videos too. If you're interested in giving it a go, I'll have a link down below so that you can check it out. Now, on to my tips for creating a great daily artwork. And these tips aren't necessarily just for a daily art challenge. These are things that I've done in the past, whether it be for Houly or for commercial work when I'm working to a very tight deadline. All of these things really help in putting out good work in a short period of time. And so I hope they help you in Mardini. Let's get straight into it. So the first tip happens before you even get into Houdini. And this has to do with planning. Now, each day you're going to get a topic and you're going to know what the topics are ahead of time. Now, let's say, and this is from last year, that you get translucent, right? That's the topic. Now, if you look at the top 3 entries for translucent, the one entry was Blackpixel, who had an orange slice. So an orange segment, and it had all of the little cells of the orange, and you could sort of see through it, right? And it looked really good. The other artwork was my artwork, and mine was a little blob, right? He was a little blob dude. He's got no face, he's just got a mouth, and he eats this thing on the floor, and you can see it shining through his stomach after he eats it. The top entry, which also won the best artwork in the competition, was a beer entry. So this was by Hösl, and his entry was honestly incredible. And his was a glass with beer pouring into it. So the beer was pouring in and it was foaming up as it pours in. As you can see, these are 3 very different takes on the same topic. Now, what you'll also notice is that these are 3 very different approaches. If you take a look at Höhsl, this is dynamics heavy. If you take a look at my entry, my one was animation heavy. And if you take a look at Blackpixel's entry, this one was heavy on the side of modeling. Now, all of these had to be shaded well. We all focused on a good render for the final product, but we all focused on different aspects, and all of us came top 3. Now, this just shows that you can also work to a strength in your planning process. I knew that as far as dynamics go, I'm probably not going to do too well. And so I went with something a bit more comical. I went for something that I thought was fun, but also something where I could just focus on the rendering, right? Where I could just make something that looks good, that isn't too much work. Now, when you enter, you may know that perhaps you are better at animating than you are at doing flip dynamics. In that case, you might want to focus your energy on animation. If you know that your animation isn't good, maybe you want to focus on modeling. But whatever you focus on, make sure that it's something that you can manage in that 24-hour time frame. Another thing about this is that I initially thought of doing some sort of slime that moves along the ground, and that would have been dynamics based, right? So I would have had this sort of slime that moves along the ground, sort of like an amoeba or something, but it's made of these little cellular type things. But I didn't actually know how to go about doing that. So I went for something that I was comfortable with. And then I also focused on what is this blob going to do specifically, right? So he's going to be sitting there, but what is going to make him interesting? And so I thought, well, if he had to eat something and you can see the thing inside of his stomach, that's pretty cool. And that's where the idea of this flashing sort of rock candy looking thing came from. That's sitting on the floor. And then he eats that. and it ends up in his stomach. And so with this sort of planning, I knew a couple of things. I knew there's no dynamics. I knew that my framing for my camera would be something like this. I knew that he needs to be able to animate, so he needs to be able to bend. So that means that he's going to have some bones. So he's going to have bones there and a bone there, something like that, where he can bend over. Going to need a control for the mouth. And then this brought me onto other questions, such as how is this looking for rendering time? Because I have to focus on things like transmission. Is this going to take too long to render? Is it going to be noisy? And all of this came up in the planning phase. So these are the types of things that you should probably consider before you actually go into making your artwork. And these types of things will save you a lot of time. My next tip is to start simple. This is my entry for squash and stretch. Now, if you haven't seen it, I'll have it up on the screen now. But you would never guess that this is how it started, right? I had these sort of balloon type things and I fed it into a vellum network. So, it's very simple. There's just a weird little shape that I copy some points onto, just like that. And then I remesh them and turn them into cloth. I glue them together and I give them pressure. Now, if you feed that into a vellum network, so let's just do a vellum solver over here, then just give it some pop wind and play it back. Then you end up with something like this. Now, this is very far from what I ended up with, but this inspired my final idea. In this case, my idea was to make each one of these like a foil balloon, and have them all sort of clumping together and changing shapes, and it would just be very nice looking. And this could have actually been an entry. Like, this could have been all there is to it. And I just give each balloon a different color and give it some nice iridescence. But what I ended up doing was this balloon dog. And so here's this balloon dog over here, and he just inflates, right? Now, as you can see, it's a similar idea. Multiple shapes connected together, but now I'm giving it form. And so my idea evolved, but I started with something simple. And so this is something that I think is a good approach. You start with something simple, and then you think about how you can sort of spruce it up and make it stand out. But all of the ideas from this were found in this initial thing that I did, which is just these weird little spheres. So that's it for the second tip. It's just to start simple. Onto the third tip, and that is to cut out anything that is unnecessary. This goes back to the planning phase, where you set up your camera so that you know what's going to be in the shot. For this entry, which was my entry for fur, I have this little rabbit. And this also goes back to tip number 2. Why a rabbit? It's because I looked at a bunch of different fluffy animals and realized that rabbits are basically just a bunch of spheres joined together, right? He's one sphere for the head, one sphere for the body, a sphere for the tail, and 2 tubes basically for the feet. And then the ears are just like some curves. And so that was a big part of it. That's why I went for a bunny, right? They're super simple. They're not very complicated looking creatures if you just make them super fluffy. So that's one part to it. The other part is that if you look at the other side of him, his eye is not in its socket. And he has no fur. There's no fur on the side of the body. And that's important because it saved me time. Not putting fur on the side of the body means that I don't have to groom the side of the body. And this eye that's out of place, that's just because I mirrored that eye over and the model wasn't perfectly symmetrical. And so there's all sorts of things that go on behind the scenes that you don't really see, like this rabbit's floating, right? But to the camera, he's just sort of sitting very comfortably in this cloth. There's a lot of things that you don't see that are a complete mess. And the same thing goes for my owl entry. For feathers, there was no feathers on the back of my owl. And this happens time and time again in my different setups, where you have to kind of cut corners. You have to pull things that aren't seen by the camera to ensure that you get things done quickly. So that's the third tip. Let's move on to the fourth tip. So my fourth tip is to make use of the power of Houdini. So that is to make use of reusability, proceduralism, and instancing. So I'm going to take you through this setup. Now, at first glance, it seems extremely complex. There's a lot going on. There's lanterns and all of these wires and all sorts of things going on. There's different rooms and air conditioners and all these pipes on the walls. But when you break it down, it's actually just a lot of the same thing. For example, if I look at the crates, I made one crate over here. I duplicated it over for the different crates over here. And then I did that a bunch of times. And all I did was just move them around. Those two at the back, you kind of collapse over. And all of a sudden, you have a whole bunch of assets to fill the alley with. Same thing with the boxes. Made a version that was open and then one that was closed. And then you just rotate them and scale them, and you end up with what looks like lots of different size boxes. Graphic cones, exact same thing. And then you start to look at the lanterns. All of these lanterns over here, all I had to do was make a single lantern, which is, you know, maybe 15 minutes of work. Let me just go find my lantern. Yeah, right, it's super simple. So this was just a little network that I put together where I made a lantern. And so this lantern then gets instanced. And I'll show you how instancing works really quickly. I just made some points over here. And this is just a bit of coding stuff and whatnot to make the wires drop like that. But basically, and it's a mess over here, so forgive that. But as you can see, these points over here are where I instance the lanterns to. And then I just give them things like random rotations and brightnesses and things. And what you end up with is lanterns being instanced just like that. So this is what actually gets rendered. If you take a look at the Redshift settings and go to instancing, I say instancing using Redshift instances. On the actual geometry over here, I just say that I want to instance this particular object. So s at instance equals this particular object, which is this rounded lantern, right? So now each of these points that I have over here, so as you can see, those points, they all get a lantern instance to them. And these 2 points over here get a different lantern instance to them. So by doing that, I add a lot of complexity to a shot just by repeating the use of an asset and adjusting it through instancing. So they all have different brightnesses and they have different rotations. These wires over here, it might look like there's a lot going on, but if you just go over to the cables and pipes, right over here, all of this stuff, super simple, right? I make one subnet that generates these lines for me, and I just duplicate it over. Alt, click and drag, and you have more pipes, right? Just like that. And you have one over here and one over here, and it's super simple. And then this thing on the side, I don't actually go in and create all these pipes. I just sort of create something that's a set of rules, right? That's proceduralism for you. You create a set of rules, and those rules can be used to create whatever you want. So in this case, I have all of these lines, and they get converted to pipes. Firstly, you polywire them so that you end up with what sort of looks like pipes, but then you take the endpoints of them and you add these, right? These connectors. And when you merge them together, you end up with pipes, right? And so you subdivide the one on the side here, so they smooth out and look more like pipes. And you just merge in the pipe ends. And all of a sudden you have insane levels of detail that's really easy to manage. There's even one other tip I can show you over here. Something like rain, right? Now rain, what you could do is you could actually have points falling from the sky and you can make them splash on the ground and all of that. Or you could just make a box and you scatter some points and you jitter them a bit and you give them velocity on the y-axis, right? At the same speed as gravity, minus 9.8. And all of a sudden you have fake rain. You activate motion blur, you give them a basic material, and you end up with streaks of water, and it looks really good. So something like this actually takes long to render. That's why I had to make this one a still. And that's something else that you're going to have to take into consideration. And I'll get to that later. It's about rendering, especially in a closed space like this. The next tip is about avoiding large-scale simulations or high-resolution simulations, and rather going for something that fakes that. Now, there's multiple ways to do this. Firstly, you can fake movement with softs. And a great example of this is if I just drop down a geometry node and place a grid and just give it some rows and columns, and then use a ripple node. You can fake movement with softs. right? You can do this with Vex as well. You can do it with all sorts of things. And if you move this away from the center, right, you can actually use this and sort of do an effect where it looks like you've done dynamics when you really haven't. And you add a noise to this, so let's do an attribute noise, and you affect the position. So you put P, you can just do a 0-centered and decrease the amplitude, and all of a sudden you've got more detail in it. And then you do something like a subdivide, right? Now if you play this back, the amount of detail that you're getting is quite impressive, right? And it's just 4 nodes, but you're faking a lot of dynamic movement with just a few stops. You can even make that noise move, right? So instead of having the offset as 0, you can put $T. And now as time goes by, that noise also moves. And things like this give you a lot of interesting movement, and it's very cheap. This also reminds me of something that Christopher Rutledge did. It was one of his winning entries, and it was awesome. For his wave entry, he did something sort of similar to this. I'm sure he did some sort of Vex for it, as opposed to just using a ripple node, where he created waves on probably just a grid, and then he used some fur over that, no real dynamics, and he ended up with the winning entry. It was awesome. I'll show you what it looked like. Now, that's one example where you do stops to fake dops. You can also do pops to fake dops. I know it sounds kind of silly when I say all these things. Now, what I struggled with for my slow motion entry was trying to create smoke pouring out of the eyes of this mask. And I'll show you the entry. It's this one over here. I wanted smoke to come pouring out of the eyes. And so I tried doing that with a pyrosolver and a smoke object and a pyro source and all of that. As you can see, this is where the eyes are, right? It lines up over there. And so my idea was to have smoke pouring out. And it just wouldn't happen. It wasn't coming right. Until I changed the way I did it. What I did was, I put this into a pop solver. And this pop solver runs obviously slower than real time, but pretty decently. And all it has is like a pop wind, an interact, and it sort of just pours out of the mask. Now, how do you convert that into smoke? This is a pretty cool trick. If you go over here, this is my pop net. So this is what I end up with, right? This thing that looks like smoke pouring. But then I put it into this attribute wrangle. I say find all of the points near to each point and use that to control density. So if there's lots of points close to each other, I have higher density. And then I have a dissipation. So as these particles age, they dissipate, right? So now I'm faking density and I'm faking dissipation. And if I show you in this color node, that's what the density looks like, right? So this is what I'm getting out of my popnet. And when you use a volume rasterize attributes on density, you end up with smoke, right? And it actually looks like smoke. And then you can use that. So at the end of the day, I ended up with smoke, just like that. And this sort of fake smoke took, you know, 1/10 of the time that real smoke would have taken. Maybe even, honestly, I don't even think I could have simulated the type of smoke that I needed in that time frame. I think this was probably the only way to do it. But yeah, I had to fake it. I had to use pops to fake dots. The other thing that you can do is to fake resolution. If you look at all of these pieces of cloth at the back, they look very high res. That's not the case. Once again, it's about faking resolution simulation. It can run in almost real time. But once you reach this point, you can vellum post-process. When you post-process, it gives you some subdivisions, it detangles, and adds thickness. All of a sudden, that very low resolution cloth that I had is now pretty high resolution. So once again, I have faked high resolution by just up-resing at the end. And this is something that I suggest you do. You can also do something like a cloth deform, where you have a high resolution cloth, you run a low resolution simulation, and then you deform the cloth based on the low resolution simulation. Alright, the next tip has to deal with rendering. So, this current file that I have open was one of my winning entries. It won on day 18 or 16? 16, yeah, 16. It was for feathers. So this one was a still. The reason I'm mentioning that is because if you don't have access to a third-party renderer like Redshift, you're probably going to have to stick to using stills. Rendering a video with Mantra can take quite long. Now, that's definitely not to say that Manta is a bad renderer, right? There's pros and cons to every renderer. Redshift's pro is its speed. It's very fast. Another pro of it is that it has good integration with Houdini. One of the cons is that it isn't as realistic as other renderers. Arnold and Mantra are two of the best renderers in the industry. However, they are a lot slower, and so the cost of a high quality render is the speed. So that means that you should probably stick to stalls, but that doesn't mean that you're not going to win with a stall. If your stall is good, then you'll have no problem. The other thing that I wanted to show you about this is rendering out a background. So shallow depth of field is something that slows down a render. This is another cheat that I did. If you take a look at my background, all I have is a grid, and I've just thrown some random image on it. And once you do that, you can decrease the saturation. I just do a little bit of code to do that. And then I blur the color, right? So by doing that, I end up with fake depth of field. In the final render, it looks like this, with a different image, of course. And that really speeds up the render. Now, there are a few things that will really slow down your render, and I'm going to go through them quickly. First, avoid or limit the use of volumetrics. Volumetrics are things like smoke, or fog, or mist. Those sort of things really slow down the render because light has to travel through those things, and that can heavily impact the amount of time it takes to accurately render. Also avoid HDRIs or multiple light sources. Now, in a lot of cases, you might be able to get away with an HDRI because it just simplifies your lighting setup. You throw down an HDRI and your lighting just looks good. However, it is treated as multiple light sources because they are varying areas of intensity and brightness and color. It is quite computationally heavy. Same thing with multiple light sources. The more light sources, the more calculations, the longer the render time. The next thing is dark and closed scenes. If you have a scene that is closed off, so you're having light sources that are bouncing around internally, that can take very long to clean up because there are a lot of rays to calculate bouncing around. It can slow down your render time. Another thing is, if it's dark, there's fewer light sources. Those light sources take longer to clean up. The other thing that you should try to avoid has to do with your materials. Try and avoid subsurface scattering and transmission. Those two things also require light to pass through them, so they have internal balances, and that can also slow down your render. So anything like glass, diamonds, skin, any of those can really slow down your render. And finally, try and do as much as you can in COPs. So during Houly, you weren't allowed to use third-party compositing software, right? And this year, I believe it's the same, so you have to use COPs. So that's Houdini's compositing tools. So as you can see, this one, I made a few adjustments. If you have Redshift, you have access to post effects, but I just made a few minor adjustments. And what that allows is to go from this on the right to this more impactful image on the left. However, in certain cases, there's a lot more that you can do inside of COPs. So here's an example of what I did inside of COPs. So I had this render and I really wasn't happy with it, right? There was a lot lacking. It just didn't have enough impact. So I rendered a separate pass, right? Where I have this thing that shatters at this frame. So on the one side, I did some corrections. You can see that I go from this on the left to this on the right. As you can see, there's some nice glow and I've removed some noise and it just looks generally a lot better. However, after that, I then comp in the stuff on the side. So I have a bunch of little compositing tricks that I do, and I mix it together with the original. So then I go from this, which is the starting render, to this over here, right? So now it's a lot more interesting. I have this thing that looks like glass shattering, and this was added in post, right? This was added in COPs. And then finally, you end up with this. And so if I show you a different frame, you can see that this sort of thing is only possible with COPs because at the base level, it just looks like this on the right. So this on the right is before any processing. This on the left is afterwards. So having these two play back side by side, it looks like this. And a lot of this was done in COP. right? So there is a lot you can do after you've rendered. So be sure to try and fix up your image as best you can with cops. There's quite a few things that you can do. There's noises, and you can adjust color balances and all of those things. So give that a try. And yeah, that should help you with your renders. So that's it for this video. There's going to be more information about Mardini. Check back on the side effects website on, I believe, the 28th of Feb. They're going to have more information there. So yeah, all the best. I hope to see you at the Mardini Daily Art Challenge, and I hope these tips help you. So I'll see you next time. Bye.